Mid-February 1943, Tunisia. A captured American Sherman tank stood silent under the hot desert sun. Its white star was still visible, now crossed with a black German mark. Officers gathered around it, silent, curious. They didn't know yet that this machine would change everything. German soldiers drove the Sherman across the desert, 350 kilometers of dust and stone. The tank never stopped, never broke, never overheated. Each mile made them more uneasy. How could an enemy machine be this perfect? At the port of Sfax, the Sherman waited beside cargo ships. Officers read new orders, straight from Berlin. The tank must be sent to Germany, intact, ready for tests. They wanted to know why it worked so well, and if it could teach them what they had missed. The ship left the African coast, moving north through the dark sea. German engineers waited, their notebooks open, their pride at stake. Could a mass-produced American tank truly outperform the best of Germany? Stay with us to find out what they discovered. Spring 1943, Germany. The captured Sherman rolled from the railcar at Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. Its olive paint was dusty from travel, but the white star could still be seen under the German cross. Engineers gathered around, notebooks ready, measuring, touching, whispering. The tank looked foreign, yet strangely solid. They gave it a German number, Zugkraftwagen 259, and marked its hull with chalk. For the men watching, this was not just another trophy. It was a question made of steel. How could something built by mass production survive the desert, the sea, and this long journey without breaking? As it cooled in the cold German air, the Sherman seemed to breathe calmly, like a creature that belonged to no nation. The tests were about to begin, and pride was about to tremble. Inside the large hangar, engineers began their quiet work. They measured armor angles, counted bolts, and took photographs from every side. One lifted the engine cover. Another checked the gears. Every detail was written down. The men spoke softly in German, but their faces showed surprise. The parts looked simple, almost too simple, yet everything fit perfectly. They compared it to their own tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and prototypes that always demanded care. The Sherman was different. It was made for soldiers, not engineers. It forgave mistakes. It accepted dust and cold without complaint. For the first time, they realized perfection might not be about complexity, but endurance. The more they studied, the quieter the room became, because the truth was heavy. Days passed. Each test brought more confusion. The Sherman's transmission used herringbone gears, something Germans had once dismissed as impractical. Yet here it was, smooth, strong, and silent. The gear teeth carried stress across many points, so nothing wore out quickly. Even the air filters looked clever, easy to clean, made for real soldiers in real dust. In their notebooks, the engineers wrote reluctantly, efficient, durable, simple. Words rarely used for American machines. One technician whispered, "They build like they drive, easy, but it works." Another replied, "Maybe we build too beautifully." Outside, snow began to fall over Kummersdorf, and the tank waited quietly in the cold. It had nothing to prove, only to keep running. Each morning, engineers returned to the tank. They circled it slowly, measuring and listening. Some crouched near the tracks, feeling the metal that had survived African heat and salt sea air. Others watched the suspension rise and fall as it moved over rough ground. There was no creak, no complaint. The Sherman behaved like a machine that trusted itself. Inside the testing office, maps and charts covered the walls. German officers spoke in quiet voices, trying to explain what they could not deny. Their own tanks were powerful, but fragile. This one was ordinary and unstoppable. One man finally said, "This is not engineering, it is philosophy." They didn't yet know that philosophy would haunt them for the rest of the war. Late at night. Kummersdorf was quiet. The engineers worked under lamps, their breath fogging in the cold air. A few of them stood by the Sherman, still warm from testing. They could hear the metal tick, soft sounds of cooling. One man touched the hull and whispered, "It feels alive." Another replied, "It feels different." No one argued. Even the most arrogant among them felt a new kind of respect. That night, a report was written for Berlin. It spoke of unexpected durability, of strange design choices that worked better than they should. But beneath the technical language was a quiet fear that Germany was fighting an enemy not of superior guns, but of superior machines that did not break. Outside, snow kept falling, covering tracks and footprints. Only the Sherman remained visible, a dark shape that refused to disappear. The more they studied the Sherman, the more it unsettled them. German tanks were built like watches, each part demanding precision, each movement dependent on another. But this American machine, it was like a farmer's tractor. Simple, forgiving, unbreakable. The engineers found no secret alloy, no hidden complexity. Instead, they found something rarer. Design made for ordinary hands. They realized it had been built not for show, but for survival. Bolts could be replaced easily. Gears could be repaired in the field. Nothing required perfection, only function. Every screw seemed to say, "I can be made again tomorrow." For German pride, this was a quiet insult, and a lesson wrapped in steel. Because the Sherman had been made to live, not to impress. When they reached the transmission, something changed. They found herringbone-cut gears, the kind that shared pressure across every tooth. No grinding, no stress marks, just a steady hum. German specialists exchanged looks. Their own tanks used sharp, straight-cut gears, louder, weaker, more fragile. They had called herringbone design too expensive, too difficult. But here it was, made in thousands, by factories that never stopped. They turned the shafts by hand, smooth like silk. The notes written that day were careful, efficient, balanced, exceptional endurance. For engineers trained to worship precision, it was like discovering humility. They realized America's strength wasn't magic. It was a process, and that process built a machine that refused to fail. For the first time, German science bowed to simplicity. In Kummersdorf, the tests continued. Fuel trials, obstacle runs, hours of endurance. The Sherman climbed slopes, crossed trenches, and kept running. Its radial engine made a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. No overheating, no stalls. The Germans had spent years chasing speed and power, but this tank chased reliability and caught it. At night, engineers gathered around their notes. They spoke quietly about what they had seen. "Americans build for the driver," one said. "They expect a soldier, not an engineer." Another nodded. "Maybe that's why their machines live longer than ours." Outside, frost covered the steel hull. The Sherman stood still, but it had already moved something inside them. By early April, the notebooks were full, pages covered with small, careful handwriting. Temperature readings, vibration data, fuel numbers, everything was measured, and yet one fact stood above all. The Sherman refused to break. Day after day, test after test. Its systems worked as if built for forever. Some engineers began calling it the tractor that fights. They laughed softly, but there was unease behind the humor. Every note written in ink was also a quiet admission that their own perfection had failed them. At lunch breaks, they argued in the cold corridors. One said, "Our tanks are better weapons." Another replied, "Yes, but this one is a better machine." The difference was small in words, but enormous in truth. When evening came and lights dimmed over Kummersdorf, the Sherman stood motionless under tarps. It did not shine like German steel, yet it carried a quiet confidence. It looked like something built to last longer than the war itself. Weeks later, something began to change in their tone. They stopped comparing and started learning. The engineers realized that American success came not from genius, but from patience. The Sherman was built by thousands of hands, not a few brilliant minds. It was designed to be fixed by anyone, in any weather, anywhere. Germany built for heroes. America built for soldiers. And that difference was the hidden weapon. In one late meeting, a senior officer said quietly, "If we had built like this from the start, we might not be losing." No one answered. The words fell like snow through the silence. Outside, the stars hung over the test field, reflecting in puddles of melted frost. The Sherman stood alone in the dark, its paint dull and strong. To the men who studied it, it no longer looked like an enemy. It looked like a teacher. June 1943. The Kummersdorf range was alive with movement. Officers arrived in dark cars, notebooks and cameras ready. Among them stood Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, a man used to power and precision. In front of him were the newest German machines, the Panther and the Ferdinand, both shining, complex, and proud. Beside them stood the captured Sherman, smaller, simpler, quiet. The tests began with hill climbs. Engines roared across the proving ground. The Panther shook the earth but strained near the top, its gears screaming under pressure. The Ferdinand stalled halfway, smoke pouring from its vents. Then the Sherman moved. Slow, steady, smooth. Its driver shifted gears effortlessly, like a man driving to work, not to war. Speer watched and said nothing. As the Panther reached the hilltop, its engine coughed, then stopped. The driver tried again, gears grinding loudly. Officers turned away, pretending not to notice. The Sherman rolled forward next, climbing with calm rhythm, no noise, no struggle. Its engine sang softly. Its tracks bit evenly into the soil. One German technician whispered, "It climbs like it wants to live." When it reached the top, the crowd stayed silent. A few men clapped quietly, not in pride, but disbelief. For years they had worshipped complexity, and now watched simplicity win. The Ferdinand was still stuck below, steam drifting into the air like surrender. Speer removed his gloves slowly. He didn't say a word, but his expression told everyone. They had a problem no tank could fix. That evening, in a wooden barracks near the range, the engineers wrote their reports. They used careful words. Consistent performance, stable transmission, unexpected endurance. No one wrote the truth out loud, that the Sherman had just humiliated German industry. Speer walked in briefly, reading a few pages, saying little. His silence was worse than anger. The men understood. These reports would travel to Berlin, to men who still believed German tanks were the finest in the world. But facts were stubborn. The numbers, the photographs, the results, they told a story of loss. Not of war, but of pride. For the first time, some of them began to ask, if their machine works better, what else do they do better? The next morning brought the official debrief. Charts, sketches, and photographs were displayed across a long table. The Sherman's data was clean. Fewer faults, higher endurance, smoother control. The Panther and Tiger numbers looked strong, but not honest. Everyone in the room felt it. The difference was no longer hidden in steel. It was written in the faces of the men who built it. Outside the hall, the tank stood under the trees. Its olive paint glowed softly in the morning sun. A young mechanic approached and touched the hull. He whispered, "It just works." Another engineer nearby sighed quietly. Yes, and that's what wins wars. For the first time, the air round Kummersdorf felt heavy, as if pride itself had cracked. Later that week, the tests ended. Speer left with a single sentence to his aide. They build what we dream of. The engineers packed their notes, their pride quieter than before. They had learned something that would echo long after the war, that reliability was not weakness. It was mastery. The Sherman had not just passed their tests, it had passed through their beliefs. If you found this story as surprising as they did, give this video a like. It helps us bring more hidden moments like this to light. In the next chapter, we'll see what happened when the reports reached Berlin, and how the truth spread through the Reich. When they began to open the tank, the true surprise came. Panels lifted easily. Bolts came free without force. No rust, no hidden flaws. Each piece fit like part of a careful puzzle designed to be removed and replaced by any mechanic. There was no mystery, only logic. The Sherman was not meant to impress. It was meant to survive. Inside the engine bay, the metal looked clean and practical. The cables were labeled, the layout simple enough for a soldier to understand. One German officer sighed. "It's not beautiful, but it works." Another replied, "That is beauty." The sentence stayed with them, as the cold morning light fell on the steel. It wasn't perfection they were looking at, it was purpose. They gathered around the powertrain. The Continental radial engine sat low and compact, its cylinders like petals of a metal flower. It was built for airplanes, but it served the tank just as well. Where German engines demanded constant tuning, this one simply worked. The engineers started the motor again and again. It purred each time, steady and calm. They wrote in their notes, "Resistant to dust, resistant to heat, maintains temperature stability." One younger man whispered, "It's like it doesn't care where it fights." They realized that American engineers had built not for performance, but for forgiveness. Their design accepted the world as it was, dirty, hot, imperfect, and worked anyway. For the Germans, that idea felt almost revolutionary. Next came the parts study. They disassembled the gearbox, the filters, the couplings, and compared serial numbers. Every piece matched, interchangeable, identical, perfect in its sameness. They realized this tank could be built in 100 factories, and every bolt would fit. In Germany, such standardization was only a dream. Here, it was reality. An older engineer stared at the neat rows of parts on the table. He said softly, "Ours are built by craftsmen, theirs by a system." He meant it as criticism, but even he heard the respect in his own voice. In that moment, they understood the real enemy wasn't the tank. It was the idea behind it, an idea born from mass production, not individual genius. And that idea could not be stopped with armor. One evening, they compared the Sherman's suspension to that of the Panther. The German design was elegant but fragile, with dozens of small moving parts that demanded constant attention. The Sherman's bogies were heavier, simpler, built to take punishment. Each wheel looked like it could survive a war on its own. A mechanic hit one with a wrench. The sound echoed like a bell. It was solid, unapologetic. They tested movement again, rolling over stones and mud outside the hangar. No groans, no failures. Only the steady rhythm of metal and earth. In the cold wind, the engineers realized the difference between design and endurance. They built machines that needed perfection to work. The Americans built machines that worked because perfection wasn't required. That was not weakness. It was wisdom. By late spring, Kummersdorf had changed. The Sherman still stood in the test field, its paint faded but its spirit unbroken. Engineers no longer spoke with arrogance. They spoke with curiosity. Reports grew more honest. Better endurance, easier maintenance, minimal failures. These were not the words Germany wanted to read. But truth, once written, does not burn easily. In the mess hall, someone said quietly, "We are losing to a factory." No one laughed. The others stared at their coffee cups, each man thinking the same thought. That war was not just fought with soldiers, but with systems. Outside, the tank waited in silence, dust glowing in the last light of day. Soon, those reports would reach Berlin, and pride would meet reality. The first reports left Kummersdorf in sealed folders, stamped Geheim, secret. Inside were pages filled with graphs, charts, and machine sketches. The data was undeniable. The Sherman had outperformed every German design in mechanical reliability. It had driven farther, climbed longer, and failed less. Numbers do not lie, even when men wish they did. In Berlin, officers read in silence. The words were dry and technical, but the meaning burned through them. Operational endurance exceeds expectation. Maintenance minimal. Transmission flawless. It was as if a foreign language had entered German engineering. one that spoke of humility and efficiency. Some refused to believe. Others understood instantly that this single tank was not an exception. It was a warning. At the Ministry of Armaments, the files reached Albert Speer's desk. He turned the pages slowly, tracing each line with his finger. His eyes lingered on one sentence. Comparable endurance not achieved in any German vehicle to date. For a man who built the industrial backbone of the Reich, it was more than criticism. It was revelation. Later that evening, Speer met with his senior engineers. He placed the report on the table and said only one thing. "Gentlemen, they have mastered what we ignored." The room was silent. In the background, through the windows, Berlin's factories glowed faintly red under blackout curtains. The war still raged. But in that moment, Speer understood something far more dangerous than defeat on the battlefield. Defeat in design. Days later, a carefully edited version of the findings appeared in Das Reich newspaper. It praised American innovation, but wrapped it in cautious language. The Sherman represents a notable achievement of the North American steel industry, it read. To the public, it was meant as reassurance. To those who knew the truth, it was confession disguised as propaganda. Behind closed doors, officers joked bitterly. At least our newspapers still fight better than our tanks. The humor didn't last. For the first time, morale among engineers began to shift. They were no longer defending their machines. They were studying their enemies. And though they would never say it aloud, most already knew. The Sherman had passed every test, including theirs. By late summer, new reports arrived from field units. They confirmed what Kummersdorf had already shown. Panther tanks breaking down after less than 100 kilometers. Shermans crossing entire fronts without a single mechanical stop. German officers began to avoid the word reliability altogether. It had become painful, almost taboo. Inside factories, engineers worked longer hours, redrawing blueprints, testing alloys, hoping to catch up. But no matter how precise their machines became, something deeper was missing. Simplicity. American tanks were not better because of luck, but because their builders trusted common sense over ego. The realization spread quietly through the Reich's design offices. In a war of pride versus practicality, pride was losing. Autumn arrived, and so did the whispers. Some officers began to speak of the American miracle. They said it quietly in corridors when no one important was near. Others dismissed it. Machines don't win wars. But in their hearts, they knew. Sometimes they do. Because a tank that simply moves when ordered can change history. In the cold Berlin air, smoke from the factories mixed with fog. Trains carried new parts, new dreams, and new doubts. The Sherman's shadow had reached far beyond Kummersdorf. It haunted every drawing board, every late-night meeting, every report stamped urgent. The next chapter of the war would not be about who shot farther, but who could keep moving longer. At Kummersdorf, tests had ended, but the numbers remained. Charts showed the truth with cold precision. The Sherman's operational readiness, 80% or more. The Panthers, sometimes less than 40. No matter how powerful the German guns, most of them never reached battle. The machines were prisoners of their own perfection. In meetings, officers argued about solutions: more training, better oil, new gear materials. But deep down, they knew the issue wasn't maintenance. It was mindset. The American tank accepted imperfection. It kept going even when damaged. The German tank demanded obedience, and in war, obedience breaks before steel does. On the Eastern Front, the pattern was the same. German tanks stood silent in the snow, their engines frozen, transmissions cracked. Meanwhile, captured Shermans taken from American and British units were driving under German flags without modification. Mechanics wrote in their diaries, "It runs. It always runs." Even enemy steel had become their salvation. At Kummersdorf, this irony wasn't lost on anyone. They tested, repaired, adjusted, but the truth kept returning. A working Sherman was worth more than a broken Panther. No one wanted to say it aloud, yet every soldier already knew. Reliability had become a new kind of weapon: invisible, quiet, undefeated. Inside German tank schools, new officers still trained on Panthers. They memorized manuals filled with warnings. Avoid Gear 3. Don't turn in reverse. Each lesson sounded less like instruction and more like confession. The tank was powerful, yes, but fragile like glass beneath armor. Every vibration, every wrong shift could mean disaster. Across the ocean, American recruits learned differently. Their manuals spoke in plain words. If it breaks, replace it. They were not trained to fear their machines. They were trained to use them. That difference shaped entire armies. Germany built tanks that demanded respect. America built tanks that earned it. Through 1943 and into 1944, the tests continued. The numbers grew clearer and harsher. German final drives failed after 100 kilometers. Shermans ran for 2,000 before needing major repair. Every report began to sound like an obituary for German engineering. The machines themselves told the truth. Every breakdown, every failure, every mile. Mechanics tried to fix the problem with skill, but the problem was philosophy. The Panther was built like a violin, beautiful but fragile. The Sherman was built like a drum, simple, strong, and loud enough to be heard across oceans. For every Panther stopped by a snapped gear, there were 10 Shermans still rolling, covered in mud, still moving. And movement, in war, was everything. By spring 1944, even German commanders began to admit it. Field reports spoke of tanks abandoned not from battle, but from exhaustion. A working Sherman could cross countries. A broken Panther couldn't leave the depot. In private meetings, generals said quietly, "We built power. They built endurance." It was a truth that felt heavier than defeat. If you're fascinated by how design can decide destiny, subscribe for more stories like this. Each one reveals how history's smallest details changed its biggest outcomes. Because in the next chapter, those reports reach Hitler's circle, and what they decide to hide will shape the final years of the war. Winter 1944, Eastern Front. A handful of captured Shermans, once American and British, now carried black crosses on their sides. German crews, desperate for anything that worked, climbed inside, turned the engines, and listened. The sound was steady, comforting, familiar only in its reliability. For men surrounded by broken Panthers, It felt like waking from a long nightmare. They drove these foreign tanks into battle, expecting flaws, expecting failure. But the Shermans kept moving through mud, snow, and shell fire. Fuel burned evenly, gears shifted smoothly, turrets turned when ordered. Soldiers began to joke, half seriously. The Americans built these for eternity. In letters home, they wrote less about victory and more about envy. At a field repair station near Warsaw, German mechanics examined one of the captured Shermans. The tank had driven hundreds of kilometers with no failure. They opened the engine bay, expecting to find complex machinery, but saw the same simplicity that Kummersdorf had already revealed. The filters, the wiring, even the tools needed, all built for humans, not heroes. They cleaned it easily, changed the oil, and closed the hatch. One mechanic smiled. "This tank forgives mistakes." Another nodded. "Ours punishes them." It was a small exchange, but it said everything. The men didn't need to compare notes anymore. They had proof in their hands. The Sherman had become more than a machine. It was a message about how to build for life, not glory. Reports began arriving from panzer regiments using captured Shermans. They spoke not of battles, but of dependability. "Engines start every morning," one letter said. "Transmission flawless after long marches," wrote another. German officers, reading these words, felt both pride and defeat. Pride in understanding good engineering. Defeat in realizing it wasn't theirs. In Berlin, the Kummersdorf engineers read these letters with quiet respect. They knew exactly what the soldiers meant. The tank that could be repaired with a wrench instead of a miracle was the one that survived. War, they were learning, didn't reward brilliance. It rewarded persistence. And that was the kind of genius Germany had never built. By early 1945, entire German units relied on captured Shermans. Some were used for reconnaissance, others for supply, even as command vehicles. They started each day without the usual ritual of repair. No begging engines to turn over. No leaking oil pools under them. The men began to call them lucky tanks. Luck had nothing to do with it. It was design, clear, honest, and forgiving. One unit recorded driving hundreds of kilometers through snow without a single mechanical stop. For crews used to crawling under broken Panthers in the cold, it felt unreal. One soldier wrote, "When you turn the key, it answers." Another said, "It's strange to trust something made by the enemy, but it trusts us back." In the end, even in German service, the Sherman did what it was built to do: keep moving. When the reports returned from the Eastern Front, the pattern was unmistakable. Panthers failed in weeks. Tigers needed endless repairs. But the Shermans, even old and worn, were still alive. Berlin read these findings with quiet disbelief. One general wrote, "We are not losing the war to weapons. We are losing it to reliability." Those words never left the paper room, but everyone who read them knew they were true. In Kummersdorf, the original test tank, War Daddy 2, still stood beneath a thin layer of snow. It hadn't moved in months, yet it looked ready. Its engine waited for a spark that would never come. The engineers who once doubted it now walked by in silence, because that tank had become more than a machine. It was a mirror, showing them the kind of future they had never built. While soldiers fought in mud and snow, another war raged in steel and smoke. German factories struggled to produce enough tanks, bombed short of workers, and bleeding resources. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American plants worked day and night. Their assembly lines sang like choirs of machines, turning out thousands of Shermans each month. Every bolt, every engine, came from a place untouched by war. In Germany, workers labored in fear, under air raids and shortages. In America, they worked in safety, earning wages and pride. That difference built more than tanks. It built momentum. The Sherman was not just a machine of war, it was a child of freedom, born in light while its rival was forged in desperation. That contrast decided everything. As American industry expanded, German factories shrank. Air raids flattened workshops, rail lines, and engine plants. The Maybach works in Friedrichshafen burned for hours after a single British raid. ZEF gearbox factories lay in ruins. Production stopped for months, and even when it returned, the quality never did. Parts didn't fit, engines seized, gearboxes cracked. Desperate, Germany turned to forced labor. Men and women from occupied nations worked under threat, not choice. Some sabotaged machines, others simply lost hope. Screws were misaligned on purpose, filters stuffed with paper, bolts left loose. And so, even when the Panthers rolled out of the line, their failures were already inside them. No enemy shell could destroy a tank faster than despair. In Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, factories worked like clockwork. Each Sherman that left the line was built from interchangeable parts. 1,000 small miracles repeating in perfect rhythm. Engines from Ford, transmissions from Buick, armor plates from Pittsburgh. Different companies, same result. Every piece fit without adjustment. It was industry as orchestra, every note in harmony. The workers were ordinary people, mechanics, farmers, housewives, students. They built tanks by the thousands, not because of fear, but belief. Their machines carried that spirit across oceans. When one Sherman broke down, another replaced it within hours. It was not genius. It was organization. And that was how America won the invisible half of the war. The air in America was filled with rhythm, not bombs. Every clang of a hammer, every spark of a welder was a heartbeat of victory. Women in coveralls drove rivets through armor plates. Men guided cranes that lifted engines into hulls. Each tank rolled off the line, tested, fueled, and shipped to another waiting dock. There was no silence, only motion. Motion that never stopped. Across the ocean, German plants echoed with a different sound. The hum of fear, the whine of shortages, the hollow silence after each raid. Machines waited for parts that would never arrive. Workers prayed for sirens to end. In one world, production was hope. In the other, it was survival. That difference, more than any tank or gun, decided how the war would end. By 1944, Sherman production reached heights the Germans couldn't imagine. Nearly 50,000 tanks rolled from factories across the United States, each one identical, each one ready. It was more than production. It was momentum turned into metal. Germany could not catch it, because the machine of democracy never slept. If stories like this make you think differently about what wins a war, leave a comment below. Which do you believe mattered more, the weapon or the worker? Because in the next chapter, as Germany's industry begins to collapse, the answer becomes impossible to ignore. By the last winter of the war, even the strongest German divisions were slowing down. Fuel was scarce, spare parts non-existent, and tank crews began to travel more by foot than by engine. Whole battalions of Panthers were abandoned, not destroyed, simply broken. Engines froze, gears cracked, and transmissions locked in place. The soldiers joked bitterly. "We can't fight if we can't move." In the same weeks, American convoys thundered across Europe. Shermans rolled through the Ardennes, through France, through snow and mud. They were not faster nor stronger, but they were there. And in war, presence is power. The contrast became impossible to hide. One army dragged by broken machines, the other carried forward by motion. In Germany's industrial heartland, the silence grew louder than any engine. Bombed factories stood cold and empty, their roofs torn open like wounds, conveyor belts covered in dust, half-finished tanks rusting in the shadows. Once, these halls had echoed with ambition. Now they were cathedrals of defeat, silent, hollow, waiting for peace. The Allied bombings had done their work, but so had exhaustion. Without fuel, metal, or hope, production no longer meant victory. The workers who remained no longer sang, they simply survived. Some engineers still drew new designs, though none would ever be built. It was not war that killed German industry. It was realization. They had fought the wrong kind of battle all along. In early 1945, German officers began sending letters back to Kummersdorf. They no longer asked for technical updates. They asked for understanding. "How did we lose to such a simple machine?" one letter said. Another read, "It feels like they built their tanks for eternity, and we built ours for admiration." The words were heavy. The ink faded with rain and resignation. The engineers who received them said nothing. They knew the answer too well. The Sherman was never meant to be perfect, only present. That difference, the will to endure rather than impress, had won the war long before Berlin fell. And for men who had worshipped precision, that truth felt like the final defeat. The closer the war came to its end, the clearer the truth became. Tanks stood like monuments across ruined roads, silent, empty, forgotten. Some had never even fired a shell. They had died not in battle, but in failure. Men walked past them without emotion, no longer seeing glory in their shapes. Steel had lost its meaning, because it could no longer move. In the cold spring rain, the difference between nations was visible in the mud. American Shermans rolled past, engines humming softly, carrying soldiers who barely noticed their strength. For them, the tank was not a symbol. It was a tool, and that simplicity was victory. Germany had built machines of pride. America had built machines of purpose, and purpose always survives longer than pride. As Soviet artillery echoed in the distance, Kummersdorf prepared to evacuate. Engineers packed their notebooks, drawings, and the last pages of test results. Among them stood the same men who had once laughed at the Sherman's simplicity. Now they looked at War Daddy 2 one final time. Snow melted slowly from its hull, glistening like tears on steel. It had outlasted everything, the pride, the arrogance, the empire. No one spoke. A train whistle sounded far away. The men left quietly, leaving the tank behind. It was no longer a trophy, it was testimony. And when the Soviets finally reached the grounds, they found it still standing, silent, unbroken, waiting. The next chapter would no longer be about war, but about what humanity chose to learn from it. When the war finally ended, silence replaced the roar of engines. Across Europe, tank graveyards stretched from France to Poland. Broken Panthers lay beside burned Tigers, rusted monuments to ambition, but scattered among them were Shermans that still could start, even after years of battle. Mechanics turned the keys, and some engines still answered. The difference was not luck, it was legacy. Allied engineers studied the wrecks with quiet fascination. They saw how German machines had failed not from weakness, but from obsession. Too perfect to survive imperfection. The Shermans, scratched and worn, had endured every cruelty of war. They were not flawless, but they were faithful. And that, more than armor or firepower, was the final proof of who understood war better. Months later, Allied analysts opened the captured German documents from Kummersdorf. They read through pages filled with neat handwriting, detailed notes, and reluctant admiration. One line stood out. Operational endurance exceeds all German standards. Another simply said, "It cannot be broken." It was strange to find truth written by those who had once called themselves enemies. The Allied officers understood what these men had seen and feared. They knew that industry, not ideology, had shaped victory. The war had not been won by the loudest engines, but by the ones that always started. And so the Sherman's story became a lesson, not about power, but about endurance. In that realization, there was no triumph, only respect. Years passed, and Germany rebuilt. Its engineers, once bound by pride, began to study those old wartime reports again. In the new West German Army, they built a new tank, the Leopard. It was not born of arrogance, but of understanding. Reliability first, simplicity second, perfection only where it mattered. The ghost of the Sherman lived in every blueprint. In that quiet shift, the lessons of war finally took root. The men who had once tested the American tank now applied its wisdom to peace. Every bolt, every gear, every joint was designed to be replaced, not worshipped. The machine no longer symbolized dominance. It symbolized trust. War had ended, but the teaching of the Sherman never did. In museums and fields across Europe, Shermans still stood. Their paint was faded, their hulls scarred, but inside, their engines could still turn. Visitors would climb the steps, look inside the metal womb of history, and marvel. It wasn't the power that amazed them, but the patience. Decades later, those same engines could still hum, a heartbeat that refused to die. Meanwhile, rust consumed the German giants. Panthers and Tigers sat in pieces, their gears corroded, their parts unique and irreplaceable. They had been built to inspire fear, but not to last. In the quiet halls of remembrance, that difference whispered louder than any victory speech. The Sherman's endurance was not just mechanical, it was moral. It proved that the simplest truths often outlive the most brilliant lies. Today, the Sherman's story still travels through museums, history books, and voices of those who remember. It reminds us that greatness is not measured by strength, but by consistency. That victory belongs not to the flawless, but to the faithful. Every turn of its gears, every hum of its engine, is a quiet promise that reliability can outlast war itself. If this story made you see history from a new angle, share it. Because stories like these deserve to move, just like the machines that inspired them. In the next part, we'll step beyond the battlefield to see how these lessons shaped the world that came after. When the dust finally settled, the engineers who once tested the Sherman returned to quiet lives. Some taught at universities, others rebuilt Germany's new industries, but all of them carried the same memory of a tank that never stopped running. They had seen the proof of endurance, and it humbled them. For years they had designed to impress. Now they understood the value of simplicity. In the post-war years, they no longer spoke of superiority. They spoke of practicality, of the balance between beauty and purpose. Many of their later designs carried whispers of the Sherman's logic, because every great defeat carries within it a lesson greater than victory. And in Kummersdorf, that lesson had been written not in words, but in motion. Decades later, the Sherman became a museum piece, a relic of a noisy century. Children climbed on its tracks, veterans touched its armor with trembling hands. Some saw it as a weapon, others as a teacher. Its steel no longer threatened. It reminded that progress means nothing without endurance, and that every invention carries its maker's soul. Around it, time kept moving, cities rebuilt, generations passed. Yet the machine stayed the same. Its rivets, its scratches, its smell of oil, all spoke of a world that had to learn the hard way. History books could explain the war, but only the Sherman could show how it was survived. In silence, it continued to speak, and people kept listening. Victory was never just about who fired first or who built stronger armor. It was about who learned faster, who adapted, who endured. The Sherman, with all its dents and flaws, carried a quiet truth. Reliability is a form of strength, a strength that doesn't shout, but stays. And in that quiet staying, it became immortal. For every broken Panther left on the roadside, a Sherman kept rolling. For every hour lost to repair, another gained ground. That was the math that ended the war. And long after the guns fell silent, that truth continued to echo. Not as pride, but as peace. The Sherman's story is not about war. It's about endurance. It's about how strength can be quiet, and how reliability can outlast power. In its gears and steel, we see our own reflection, flawed, resilient, human. And maybe that's why its engine still matters, because it reminds us that survival is its own kind of victory. If this story moved you, if you felt something in its silence, subscribe. Join us as we uncover more truths hidden beneath history's dust. Because every forgotten machine, every quiet document, still has a heartbeat waiting to be heard.